The community hall was already filling with people long before the event officially began. Families, neighbors, local business owners, and volunteers moved around the large room, greeting one another and finding seats. Soft conversations blended together with the sound of chairs moving across the floor. It was supposed to be a simple fundraising evening, the kind of event that brought people together for a good cause. Near the back of the hall stood a woman who seemed completely unnoticed by almost everyone around her. She had arrived early to support a close friend who helped organize the event. She wore simple clothes, carried a small handbag, and stayed away from the center of attention. While others gathered in groups and introduced themselves, she preferred standing quietly near one of the walls. Nobody paid much attention to her. That was exactly how she liked it. She had never been someone who enjoyed being in the spotlight. Even during conversations, she usually listened more than she spoke. She smiled politely when people greeted her, but she rarely tried to become the focus of any discussion. As the hall continued to fill, volunteers rushed around making final preparations. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then a problem appeared. One of the organizers hurried across the room while looking down at a phone. The worried expression on their face immediately caught the attention of a few volunteers nearby. Another organizer walked over. "What happened?" one asked. The answer came in a quiet voice. "The pianist isn't coming." For a moment, nobody spoke. The event program included live piano music before the main presentation. The performer had been scheduled for weeks. Guests were already arriving, and there was very little time to find a replacement. "What do we do now?" someone asked. The organizers exchanged nervous looks. Without the music, there would be an awkward gap before the evening activities began. Several volunteers started making phone calls. Others searched through contact lists hoping to find someone available on short notice. But as the minutes passed, every option seemed to disappear. One person was out of town. Another couldn't arrive in time. Someone else didn't answer at all. The atmosphere behind the scenes became increasingly stressful. Meanwhile, the woman near the back of the hall remained completely unaware of the situation. She was speaking quietly with her friend and helping arrange a few small decorations on one of the tables. She had no idea that her evening was about to change. A few minutes later, one of the volunteers walked through the hall looking frustrated. As they searched for solutions, their eyes landed on the woman standing near the piano. It wasn't because she looked like a musician. It was because earlier in the evening they had noticed her briefly looking at the instrument. The volunteer remembered seeing her run a hand lightly across the polished surface of the piano while walking past. Most people wouldn't have thought anything of it. But right now, any possibility seemed worth exploring. The volunteer approached her carefully. "Excuse me," they said. She turned and smiled politely. "Yes. This may sound like a strange question, but do you know how to play piano?" The woman looked surprised. For a second, she wasn't sure whether she had heard correctly. "A little," she replied. The volunteer's eyes widened. "A little?" She laughed softly. "Well, I learned years ago." The volunteer immediately became interested. "Would you be willing to play something tonight?" Her smile disappeared. "No," she answered almost instantly. The volunteer blinked. "No, I haven't performed in front of people in a very long time." The volunteer understood her hesitation but wasn't ready to give up. "Our pianist had an emergency and can't come. We just need someone to play for a few minutes before the program starts." The woman shook her head. "I don't think that's a good idea. You don't need to do anything complicated." She still looked uncomfortable. The volunteer continued. "Honestly, even a simple tune would help." The words sounded harmless. Just a simple tune. Nothing difficult. Nothing important. Only a few minutes. Still, she hesitated. Deep inside, old memories began surfacing. Memories she rarely thought about anymore. There had once been a time when music filled nearly every part of her life. A time when she spent countless hours practicing. A time when sitting at a piano felt as natural as breathing. But that chapter belonged to the past. Or at least that's what she believed. The volunteer waited patiently. "No pressure," they said. "I just thought I'd ask." Before she could respond, another organizer joined the conversation. "We really need help," they admitted. "Just something simple. Most people will still be finding their seats." The woman looked toward the piano. The instrument stood quietly near the front of the hall. Its polished surface reflected the lights hanging from the ceiling. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then she looked away. "I don't know," she said. Her friend, who had been listening nearby, gently smiled. "You should do it." She laughed nervously. "Absolutely not." "Why not?" "Because it's been years." "So, what if I make mistakes?" Her friend shrugged. "Then you make mistakes." The simple answer made her smile. Still, uncertainty remained. The truth was that she wasn't afraid of making mistakes. She was afraid of something else. She was afraid of remembering. Music had once meant everything to her. Walking away from it had not been easy. Even after all these years, certain memories still carried emotion. Sitting at a piano again might reopen parts of her life she had carefully placed behind her. The organizers didn't know any of this. To them, she was simply someone who knew a little piano. Nothing more. The volunteer spoke again. "Please think about it. We'd really appreciate the help." Then they walked away to continue preparing for the event. The woman remained standing where she was. Her eyes drifted toward the piano again. The room continued filling with guests. People laughed, chatted, and found seats. Nobody noticed the quiet debate happening inside her mind. Several minutes passed. Finally, her friend leaned closer. "You know," her friend said softly, "sometimes opportunities arrive when we least expect them." She smiled. "That's a nice saying." "It's true." "Maybe." Her friend nodded toward the piano. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Those words stayed with her. You don't have to prove anything. Maybe that was why the idea suddenly felt less frightening. Maybe she didn't need perfection. Maybe she didn't need applause. Maybe she could simply help. A few minutes later, one of the organizers returned. Their expression immediately revealed they still hadn't found anyone else. The woman sighed quietly. Then she surprised herself. "Okay." The organizer looked confused. "Okay, I'll play." For a second, the organizer seemed too shocked to respond. "Really?" She nodded. "But only something simple." The organizer smiled with obvious relief. "That's all we need." Within moments, the news spread among the volunteers. A replacement had been found. The crisis was over. At least they thought so. As guests settled into their seats, the woman slowly walked toward the piano. Each step felt strangely familiar. The closer she came to the instrument, the more memories returned. Years seemed to disappear. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background. The piano stood waiting. She reached it and paused. For a brief moment, she rested her hand on its surface. The polished wood felt cool beneath her fingertips. A deep breath escaped her lips. Around the room, people continued their conversations. Most weren't even paying attention. A few guests noticed someone sitting at the piano and assumed the scheduled performer had arrived. Nobody expected anything unusual. Nobody expected anything memorable. After all, she had only agreed to play a basic tune. Nothing more. At least that's what everyone believed. As she slowly sat down on the bench, the room remained filled with casual conversation. But in just a few moments, everything was about to change. The woman sat quietly at the piano bench while the room continued buzzing with conversation. People were still finding seats, greeting old friends, and checking their phones. Very few were paying attention to her. That was perfectly fine with her. In fact, she preferred it that way. She carefully adjusted the bench and looked down at the keys. The familiar black and white pattern stretched across the piano exactly as she remembered. For a moment, she simply stared at them. Years had passed since she had sat in front of an audience. Years. Life had changed so much that sometimes it felt as if music belonged to another person entirely. The sounds of the room faded as memories slowly returned. When she was young, there had been a small upright piano in her family's home. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't beautiful. In fact, several keys had small scratches and the pedals occasionally squeaked. But to her, it was the most important object in the house. She remembered sitting beside it every day after school. While other children played outside, she often hurried home just to spend time practicing. At first, it was simple curiosity. Then it became something more. Music made sense to her. The piano became a place where she could express feelings she didn't always know how to put into words. If she was happy, she played. If she was sad, she played. If she felt confused, nervous, or excited, she played. The piano listened without interrupting. Over time, her skills improved. Teachers noticed. Neighbors noticed. Friends noticed. People began encouraging her to continue learning. One teacher in particular believed she had unusual talent. That teacher often stayed after lessons, helping her improve difficult pieces and teaching her things that weren't included in ordinary classes. The teacher would always say the same thing. Don't just play the notes. Tell the story inside the music. At the time, she didn't fully understand those words. She thought music was mainly about accuracy, playing the correct notes, keeping the right rhythm, avoiding mistakes. But as the years passed, she slowly learned what the teacher meant. The most memorable performances weren't always perfect. They were honest. People remembered emotion more than perfection. Back then, she dreamed about music constantly. She imagined performing in beautiful halls. She imagined teaching others. She imagined spending her entire life around pianos. Those dreams felt possible. Then life happened. As she grew older, responsibilities began appearing one after another. Some were expected. Others arrived without warning. Her family faced financial difficulties. Unexpected expenses appeared. Important decisions had to be made. Gradually, her priorities changed. Instead of focusing on music, she focused on helping the people she loved. There were bills to pay, jobs to work, responsibilities to carry. Music slowly moved into the background. At first, she thought the change would be temporary. A few months away from the piano, maybe a year. Then she would return. But months became years. Years became even more years. Life continued moving forward. The piano remained behind. Of course, she never completely stopped loving music. Sometimes she would hear a familiar melody while shopping. Sometimes a song on the radio would bring back memories. Occasionally she would pass a music store and pause outside the window. For a brief moment, she would remember the person she once hoped to become. Then she would continue walking. The responsibilities of everyday life always came first. As she sat at the piano in the community hall, all those memories seemed to arrive at once. She hadn't expected that. She had agreed to play a simple tune. Nothing more. Yet simply sitting here felt emotional. She gently placed her fingers on the keys. The touch felt familiar. Not perfect. Not effortless. But familiar. Almost like reconnecting with an old friend after many years apart. Nearby, an organizer stepped toward a microphone. The conversations around the room gradually quieted. "Good evening, everyone," the organizer announced. People began turning their attention toward the front. The organizer welcomed guests and thanked everyone for attending the fundraiser. Then they mentioned the unexpected change in the program. "Our scheduled pianist was unable to join us tonight. Fortunately, someone has kindly volunteered to help us." Polite applause followed. Nothing enthusiastic. Nothing dramatic. Just respectful appreciation. Most guests still expected a short, ordinary performance. The woman actually felt relieved. Low expectations meant less pressure. The organizer smiled toward her before stepping away. Now she was alone with the piano. Hundreds of eyes were not staring at her. In fact, many people were still distracted. Some were reading event programs. Others were whispering to friends. A few were checking messages on their phones. She preferred it that way. Taking a slow breath, she looked down at the keys once more. Then she began. The first notes were soft and simple. A familiar melody floated through the room. Nothing flashy. Nothing complicated. Exactly what she had promised. A basic tune. The kind many people recognized instantly. Several guests smiled when they heard it. A few quietly hummed along. Others continued their conversations. Everything seemed normal. The woman relaxed slightly. Her nervousness began fading. Each measure felt a little more comfortable than the last. Her fingers remembered things her mind had nearly forgotten. Muscle memory slowly returned. The years away from performing seemed less important with every note. At one table, two older guests stopped talking for a moment. The melody reminded them of their younger years. At another table, a volunteer paused while organizing papers. Something about the playing caught their attention. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt genuine. The woman wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to show off. She was simply playing. And somehow that honesty could be heard in every note. As the melody continued, she became more comfortable. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing steadied. The nervous woman who had hesitated near the back of the hall seemed to disappear. In her place sat someone completely focused on the music. The piano no longer felt unfamiliar. Felt like home. A memory surfaced. She remembered something her teacher once said after a difficult lesson. Talent matters, the teacher had explained. Practice matters. But what people remember most is feeling. At the time, she thought the lesson sounded strange. Now she understood. Music was about connection. People didn't remember every note. They remembered how the music made them feel. The simple tune continued filling the room. More conversations began fading. More heads turned toward the piano. Guests who had barely noticed her moments earlier started paying attention. One person lowered their phone. Another stopped whispering. Several people looked toward the stage with growing curiosity. There was still nothing dramatic happening. She was still playing the same simple melody. Yet somehow the atmosphere in the room felt different. The music carried warmth, carried sincerity, carried years of experiences that couldn't be explained with words. The woman herself barely noticed the audience changing. She was lost in the music. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about responsibilities. She wasn't thinking about schedules. She wasn't thinking about problems waiting at home. She was simply present. The feeling surprised her. She had forgotten how peaceful music could be, forgotten how powerful it felt to communicate without speaking. As the melody reached its middle section, something unexpected happened. She smiled. It wasn't for the audience. It wasn't because people were watching. It was because she was genuinely happy. The piano had given her something she didn't realize she was missing. A connection to a part of herself that had been buried beneath years of responsibilities. Around the room, more guests noticed the change. The simple performance was becoming the center of attention. Not because of technical difficulty, not because of speed, but because every note felt meaningful. Even the organizers exchanged curious glances. One volunteer quietly whispered to another, "She's much better than I expected." The other nodded. So did I. Neither of them knew the full story. Neither knew how many years of experience sat behind that simple melody. Neither knew how much music had once meant to her. All they knew was that something special was beginning to happen. The audience could feel it. The atmosphere could feel it. And deep down, the woman could feel it too. She had agreed to play for only a few minutes. A simple tune. A small favor. Yet as her fingers continued moving across the keys, it became clear that this evening was turning into something much more important than anyone had imagined, including her. The simple tune continued flowing through the hall. At first, the audience had treated it as background music. It was pleasant, familiar, and easy to listen to. But now something had changed. People were paying attention. Not all at once. The change happened gradually. A conversation stopped at one table. Then another. A volunteer who had been arranging papers quietly set them down. Someone near the back lowered their phone and looked toward the piano. Without realizing it, the room was becoming quieter. The woman remained focused on the keys. She wasn't thinking about the audience. She wasn't wondering whether people were impressed. She was simply enjoying the feeling of playing again. The music carried her forward. Every note seemed to unlock another memory. Every melody reminded her of years she had almost forgotten. The more she played, the more comfortable she became. Her fingers moved naturally across the keyboard. Not perfectly, not mechanically, but naturally. There was warmth in her playing, the kind that comes from experience rather than practice alone. At one table sat an elderly couple. They had attended many community events over the years. Normally they enjoyed chatting quietly during performances. But tonight was different. The husband leaned forward slightly. His wife noticed. "You like this one?" she whispered. He nodded without taking his eyes off the piano. "There's something special about it." His wife listened carefully. After a few moments, she understood exactly what he meant. The music felt personal. It didn't sound like someone trying to impress an audience. It sounded like someone telling a story. Across the room, another guest noticed the same thing. Then another, and another. People couldn't quite explain it. The tune itself was simple. Most beginner piano students could probably learn the melody. Yet somehow, the way she played it made it feel different. Every phrase carried emotion. Every pause felt intentional. Every note seemed to matter. Near the side of the hall sat a retired music instructor. For years, that instructor had taught students of all ages. Hundreds of them, perhaps even thousands. Experience had taught the instructor something important. True skill often revealed itself in simple music. Complicated pieces could impress people. Simple pieces revealed musicians. As the instructor listened, a small smile appeared. The woman at the piano was clearly not an ordinary beginner. That much was obvious. The instructor could hear years of training hidden beneath every note. Not flashy training, not showy talent, real understanding, the kind that takes time to develop. The instructor folded both hands and continued listening. Meanwhile, the woman remained completely unaware. She had stopped worrying about how she sounded. She had stopped worrying about mistakes. The nervousness that followed her to the piano had disappeared. For the first time in years, she felt free. That feeling surprised her. She hadn't realized how much she missed music. Life had become busy. There was always something demanding her attention. Work, responsibilities, appointments, problems to solve, tasks to complete. Every day seemed full. Yet somehow something had always been missing. She was only beginning to understand what that missing piece had been. The piano. Not fame. Not applause. Not performance. Simply music itself. The melody continued. As she played, another memory surfaced. She remembered being young and sitting in a practice room late one evening. Most students had already gone home. Only a few remained. Her teacher sat nearby listening. After she finished a piece, she immediately began pointing out mistakes. There were several problems, she had said. Her teacher smiled. Yes. She waited. The teacher remained silent. Finally she asked, "Aren't you going to tell me what I did wrong?" The teacher laughed softly. "You already know." "What?" "The mistakes." She nodded. Of course she knew them. She remembered every single one. Then the teacher said something she never forgot. "You focus too much on mistakes. What should I focus on?" The people listening. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, sitting at the piano years later, she finally did. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. The audience didn't need flawless notes. They needed something real, something human, something they could feel. Without realizing it, she was giving them exactly that. Several rows back, a young volunteer stood frozen beside a doorway. The volunteer had originally stopped to listen for only a moment. Now several minutes had passed. The volunteer couldn't explain why. The melody simply felt comforting. It created a sense of calm throughout the room. Even people who knew nothing about music seemed drawn toward it. The hall felt different now. More peaceful. More focused. More connected. The organizers noticed it too. Earlier, they had been worried about filling an empty spot in the schedule. Now they found themselves quietly listening like everyone else. One organizer leaned toward another. "Where did she learn to play?" The other shrugged. "No idea." "Did she ever mention being a pianist?" "No." Neither organizer had expected this. They had asked for someone to play a few simple songs. Instead, The performance was becoming one of the most memorable moments of the evening. The woman gently moved into another section of the melody. Still simple, still familiar, yet somehow richer than before. Years of experience were beginning to reveal themselves, not through speed, not through difficult techniques, through expression. Every note seemed to have purpose. The audience could hear it, and they couldn't stop listening. The retired music instructor continued watching carefully. Something else had become clear. The woman wasn't merely remembering old skills. She was rediscovering herself. That process was visible in her body language. At the beginning, she had looked uncertain, almost hesitant. Now she sat with quiet confidence. Not arrogance, confidence. The kind that comes from reconnecting with something deeply familiar. The instructor smiled again. It was a beautiful thing to witness. Sometimes people spend years searching for something they lost. Sometimes they find it unexpectedly. Tonight seemed to be one of those moments. The woman herself felt the change. Every passing minute made her feel lighter. The worries she carried into the building seemed far away. For a little while there was only music. Only the piano. Only the present moment. Nothing else mattered. She glanced briefly toward the audience. The sight surprised her. Many people were watching. Actually watching. The room had become much quieter than before. Conversations had almost completely disappeared. People who had originally planned to socialize were now focused on the performance. A brief wave of nervousness returned. Then she quickly pushed it aside. If she started worrying about the audience again, she might lose the feeling she had found. So she returned her attention to the keys. The melody continued. The audience continued listening. And little by little, something unexpected happened. People began attaching their own memories to the music. One guest remembered childhood piano lessons. Another remembered a parent who loved music. Someone else remembered a family gathering many years ago. The melody became different things to different people. That is what powerful music often does. It creates space for personal memories. The woman had no idea this was happening. She was simply sharing a piece of herself. Yet the audience was receiving something much larger. Near the front row sat a man who rarely attended community events. A friend had convinced him to come. He had spent most of the evening checking his watch and thinking about work. Now he found himself completely absorbed in the performance. For the first time all week, his mind felt quiet. No deadlines, no stress, no endless list of tasks, just music. He wasn't alone. Many people felt the same thing. The hall had become united by a simple melody. No dramatic speech, no grand production, just one person sitting at a piano. As the tune approached its final section, the woman sensed something unusual. The audience's energy had changed. She could feel it. Not excitement, not anticipation, tension, complete attention. The room was listening, really listening. And suddenly she realized something. The evening was no longer about helping organizers fill empty time. It was no longer about replacing a missing performer. Something much more meaningful was taking place. The audience had connected with her music. And in return, she had reconnected with a part of herself she thought was gone forever. The realization filled her with emotion. She kept playing. The notes flowed more naturally than ever. The audience sat quietly. No phones, no conversations, no distractions, only music. And as the final section of the melody began, even those who had never met her could sense that this story was far from over. Because what started as a simple tune was slowly becoming something nobody in that room would forget. The final notes of the simple tune drifted through the hall and slowly faded away. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The room remained completely still. The silence felt different from the silence that existed before the performance began. Earlier, people had been distracted. Now they were focused. They weren't silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because they were still absorbing what they had just heard. The woman lifted her hands from the piano keys and looked down for a second. She expected polite applause, a few claps, a few smiles. Then the evening would continue as planned. Instead, something unexpected happened. The entire room erupted into applause. The sound filled the hall. People smiled, nodded, and looked at one another with surprise. Several guests even stood from their chairs. The woman blinked in disbelief. She hadn't expected that reaction at all. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. She simply sat there, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. The applause continued longer than she expected. Eventually she smiled and gave a small nod of appreciation. The audience gradually settled back into their seats. The organizer who had asked her to help walked toward the piano. There was clear excitement on the organizer's face. "That was wonderful," the organizer said quietly. The woman laughed softly. "It was only a simple tune." "Maybe," the organizer replied, "but it didn't sound simple." The comment made her smile. Before she could respond, another volunteer approached. Then another. Soon several people were standing nearby. Each person seemed to have the same question. "Where did you learn to play?" The woman wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was complicated. She couldn't summarize years of practice, sacrifice, and life experiences in a single sentence. So she simply said, "I learned a long time ago." The answer only made people more curious. Meanwhile, guests throughout the hall continued talking about the performance. The retired music instructor sat quietly, listening to the conversations. People kept saying similar things. There was something special about it. It felt emotional. It reminded me of something. I couldn't stop listening. The instructor smiled. None of those reactions were surprising. Music often worked that way. People didn't always remember technical details. They remembered feelings. And the woman had given the audience a genuine feeling. That was why the performance connected with so many people. Across the room, the evening's program was supposed to continue. Yet many guests remained focused on the woman at the piano. Several people who had never spoken to her before wanted to introduce themselves. Others simply wanted to thank her. The attention made her slightly uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being the center of anything. For years she had lived a quiet life. Most days were ordinary. Work, responsibilities, family, routine. Nothing about her daily life involved standing in front of an audience. Now complete strangers were approaching her with smiles and compliments. Felt strange. Yet it also felt surprisingly meaningful. One older guest slowly approached the piano. The guest waited until the small crowd had thinned. Then came a simple comment. "Thank you." The woman smiled. "You're welcome." The guest shook their head. "No, I really mean it." The woman looked confused. The guest continued. "My spouse loved piano music." For a moment, emotion appeared in the guest's eyes. "They passed away several years ago." The hall suddenly felt quieter. The guest smiled gently. "Tonight reminded me of them." The woman didn't know what to say. She wasn't expecting a conversation like this. After a moment she simply replied, "I'm glad the music brought back a good memory." The guest nodded. It did. Then they quietly returned to their seat. The brief exchange stayed with her. She had forgotten how deeply music could affect people. A simple melody had connected someone with an important memory. That realization felt powerful. Nearby, the retired music instructor finally stood and walked toward the piano. Unlike the others, the instructor didn't immediately offer compliments. Instead, the instructor studied her for a moment. Then came a question. "How long did you study?" The woman looked surprised. "Excuse me? How many years?" She smiled. "Quite a few." The instructor nodded knowingly. "I thought so." The woman laughed. "Was it that obvious? To someone who taught music for decades?" "Yes." The answer made both of them smile. The instructor pulled up a nearby chair. "You have good control." The woman looked slightly embarrassed. "It's been years. I can tell." She laughed. "You can?" "Of course." The instructor smiled warmly. The interesting part is that the years didn't take away the feeling. Those words caught her attention. The feeling. That was exactly what her old teacher used to talk about. The instructor continued. "Many people can learn notes." The woman listened carefully. "Many people can learn technique." The instructor paused. But very few people learn how to make others feel something. The comment stayed with her. She didn't know how to respond. Partly because she wasn't sure she deserved such praise. Partly because hearing those words awakened memories she hadn't thought about in years. For a few seconds she found herself thinking about her old teacher. The lessons, the practice rooms, the dreams she once carried, the future she once imagined. A strange mixture of happiness and sadness washed over her. Not sadness from regret, more like sadness from realizing how much time had passed. The instructor seemed to understand. "You miss it, don't you?" The question arrived unexpectedly. The woman hesitated. Then she quietly answered, "More than I realized." The instructor nodded. Neither person spoke for a few moments. The answer had said everything. Across the room, the event finally resumed. The organizer stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the main presentation. Guests returned to their seats. Conversations slowly settled. The woman stood from the piano bench and moved toward a seat near the side of the hall. For the first time all evening, she had a chance to think. And thinking became difficult. Her emotions felt tangled. Part of her was happy. Part of her was surprised. Part of her felt as if an old door had suddenly opened. A door she thought had been permanently closed. The presentations continued on stage. Speakers discussed community projects and fundraising goals. The audience listened politely, but the woman found it difficult to concentrate. Her mind kept returning to the piano, to the music, to the feeling she experienced while playing. The memory remained vivid. She could still feel the keys beneath her fingers, still hear the melody, still sense the audience becoming quiet. It had all happened so unexpectedly. One simple favor had turned into something much larger. Her friend eventually leaned over. "You okay?" The woman smiled. "I think so. You look emotional." She laughed softly. "Maybe I am." Her friend nodded. "I knew this would happen." The woman looked surprised. "You did." "Not exactly this." Her friend smiled. "But I knew sitting at that piano would mean something." The woman looked toward the stage. "Honestly, I didn't expect any of it. Neither did anyone else." That much was certainly true. No one had expected it. Not the organizers. Not the audience. Not even the woman herself. Yet somehow the evening had become memorable because of a completely unplanned moment. The rest of the program continued. People listened. They applauded speakers. They participated in activities. But throughout the evening, conversations kept returning to the same topic. The woman at the piano. Guests continued discussing the performance during breaks. Some wondered about her background. Others simply talked about how the music made them feel. The woman overheard pieces of those conversations. Each one surprised her. She had never imagined that a simple tune could leave such an impression. As the evening moved closer to its conclusion, she thought the attention would eventually fade. But she was wrong, because several people were already making plans. Some wanted to learn more about her musical history. Some wanted to invite her to future community events. And others simply hoped they might hear her play again. The woman knew none of this yet. She believed the evening was almost over. She believed life would return to normal tomorrow. She believed this was simply a pleasant and unexpected moment. But as she sat quietly listening to the final speakers, she had no idea that the piano performance was only the beginning. The most important conversations of the night had not happened yet. And before she left the hall, she was about to discover that her simple tune had touched far more people than she ever imagined. As the event slowly came to an end, people began standing from their seats and gathering in small groups around the hall. Some headed toward the refreshment tables. Others stayed near the stage, discussing the presentations they had just heard. But one topic seemed to come up again and again. The woman who had played the piano. She noticed it almost immediately. Everywhere she looked, people were smiling at her. Some nodded as they walked past. Others stopped briefly to say hello. A few thanked her again for the music. She appreciated their kindness, but the attention still felt unusual. For years, she had blended into the background of most situations. Tonight was different. As she stood near one of the tables speaking with her friend, another guest approached. Then another. Soon a small group had formed around her. Everyone seemed curious. Not in an intrusive way, just genuinely interested. One guest smiled and asked, "How long have you been playing?" She thought for a moment. "Most of my life, I suppose." The answer surprised several people. "Really?" She nodded. "I started when I was very young." Another person asked, "Do you perform regularly?" She laughed. "No, not at all." The group exchanged confused looks. That answer didn't match what they had heard earlier. Someone with that level of skill surely performed somewhere. At least that was what they assumed. One guest finally asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. "If you don't perform, why did you stop?" The woman became quiet. Not because she was hiding anything. The answer simply wasn't short. Life rarely changes because of one single event. Usually it changes little by little. One responsibility at a time. One decision at a time. One sacrifice at a time. She looked down briefly before answering. Life got busy. The group listened. There were things that needed my attention. She smiled gently. Family responsibilities. Work. Everyday life. Several people nodded. Many could relate to that. Dreams often make room for responsibilities. Sometimes temporarily. Sometimes permanently. One older guest sighed. "I understand that." Others nodded in agreement. The conversation suddenly felt personal. People began sharing their own stories. One person talked about a love for painting that had been set aside years ago. Another spoke about wanting to write but never finding time. Someone else mentioned a sport they once enjoyed but eventually stopped playing. The woman listened carefully. She realized she wasn't alone. Many people carried forgotten passions. Many people had parts of themselves they hadn't visited in years. The piano simply happened to be hers. As the discussion continued, the retired music instructor approached again. Several guests made room. The instructor smiled warmly. "I hope you don't mind me joining." "Not at all," the woman replied. The instructor looked around at the group. "I think everyone here is asking the wrong question." A few people looked confused. "What do you mean?" someone asked. The instructor smiled. "The question isn't why she stopped playing." Everyone listened. "The real question is why she never started again." The room became quiet. Even the woman found herself thinking about the answer. Why hadn't she started again? The truth was complicated. At first, she always believed she would return soon. Then the gap became longer. Eventually, returning felt difficult. The longer she stayed away, the easier it became to assume that chapter of her life was over. Years passed, then more years. Eventually she stopped thinking about coming back. At least consciously. But deep inside, the love for music never disappeared. The instructor seemed to understand. "You know," the instructor said, "many people believe talent disappears when it isn't used." The woman listened carefully. "It doesn't." The instructor smiled. "Sometimes it simply waits." Those words stayed with her. Sometimes it simply waits. For some reason, hearing that made her emotional. She looked away for a moment. Not because she was upset. Because she was realizing something important. The part of herself she thought she had lost wasn't actually gone. It had been waiting. Waiting quietly beneath years of responsibilities. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for an unexpected evening at a community fundraiser. Her friend noticed the emotion in her eyes. "You okay?" The woman smiled. "Yes." And for the first time all evening, she truly meant it. A short while later, guests began preparing to leave. People collected coats and bags. Volunteers started cleaning tables. The event had been successful. Funds had been raised. The presentations had gone well. Everything should have been winding down. Yet several people remained near the piano, almost as if they didn't want the evening to end. One organizer eventually approached the woman again. "There is something I wanted to ask." She looked up. "What is it?" The organizer smiled. "Would you ever consider playing at another event?" The question caught her off guard. She laughed softly. "I don't know. Why not? She glanced toward the piano. Because tonight was unexpected. The organizer nodded. Sometimes unexpected things turn out to be the best things. The woman smiled. She couldn't argue with that. After all, tonight had certainly proven the point. Another organizer joined the conversation. We have several community events throughout the year. The woman listened. You don't have to decide now. The organizer handed her a small card. But we'd love to hear you play again. She accepted the card. Part of her wanted to immediately decline. That would have been the easier option. The safer option. The familiar option. Yet another part of her wasn't ready to say no. That surprised her. A few hours earlier, she had resisted even sitting at the piano. Now she wasn't sure she wanted to walk away from it again. The realization felt strange and exciting. As volunteers continued cleaning, the hall gradually emptied. The noise faded. The crowds disappeared. Eventually only a handful of people remained. The woman helped her friend gather decorations and pack supplies. While working, her friend smiled. You know what tonight reminded me of? What? That people don't always see the whole story. The woman looked curious. What do you mean? Her friend pointed toward the now empty piano. Everyone saw you walk into this building. The woman nodded. They saw a quiet person. Another nod. But they didn't see the years behind that performance. The words lingered. Her friend was right. The audience hadn't seen the early mornings, the practice sessions, the lessons, the sacrifices, the dreams, the struggles. They had only seen a few minutes at the piano. Yet those few minutes were built upon a lifetime of experiences. That thought felt meaningful. Sometimes people underestimate others because they don't know their story. Sometimes hidden talents remain invisible for years. Sometimes extraordinary things exist beneath ordinary appearances. The evening had become proof of that. As the final chairs were stacked away, the woman found herself standing alone near the piano once again. The hall was nearly empty now. The bright energy of the event had faded into a peaceful quiet. She walked slowly toward the instrument. For several seconds, she simply stood there. No audience, no applause, no conversations, just silence. Then she gently placed one hand on the piano, the same way she had done earlier that evening. Only this time everything felt different. When she arrived, the piano represented a forgotten part of her life. Now it represented possibility. The possibility that some dreams never fully disappear. The possibility that passions can return. The possibility that it is never too late to reconnect with something meaningful. A volunteer called out from across the room. We're locking up. The woman smiled. Coming. She picked up her bag and headed toward the exit. As she reached the door, she glanced back one final time. The piano sat quietly beneath the lights, waiting. For some reason, she smiled. Because deep down, she had a feeling this wasn't goodbye. Not this time. And as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she had no idea that the conversation started tonight would soon spread beyond the walls of that community hall. The simple tune she played had touched more hearts than she realized. People would continue talking about it, sharing the experience, remembering the feeling. And before long, the woman who thought her musical journey had ended years ago would discover that a completely new chapter was only beginning. The days following the community fundraiser felt surprisingly normal. The woman returned to her routine. She went to work. She completed daily tasks. She handled responsibilities exactly as she always had. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Yet something inside her had changed. The memory of that evening stayed with her. Every time she found a quiet moment, she thought about the piano. She remembered the feeling of sitting at the bench. She remembered the audience becoming silent. She remembered the connection she felt with the music. Most of all, she remembered how alive she had felt while playing. That feeling refused to disappear. Several days later, her phone rang. The call came from one of the event organizers. After a brief greeting, the organizer got straight to the point. We were wondering if you'd be willing to help with another event next month. The woman smiled. The invitation wasn't entirely unexpected. Still, hearing it out loud felt different. She hesitated for a moment, not because she wanted to refuse, because she wasn't sure how to explain what had been happening inside her since the fundraiser. The organizer continued. No pressure at all. She laughed softly. That's what you said last time. The organizer laughed too. Fair point. After a brief conversation, she agreed to think about it. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a few minutes. A month earlier, she would have immediately said no. Now she wasn't so sure. That realization alone felt important. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. She started playing again. Not for an audience. Not for performances. For herself. A nearby community center allowed local residents to use a piano during certain hours. One afternoon, she decided to visit. The moment she sat down and touched the keys, she felt the same familiar connection she had experienced at the fundraiser. The years seemed to melt away. The music returned naturally. Not perfectly, not instantly, but steadily. Each visit became a little longer. What began as 30 minutes turned into an hour. Then longer. Soon playing piano became a regular part of her week. People at the community center started recognizing her. Some stopped to listen. Others simply smiled as they passed by. One afternoon, a young student approached her. The student looked nervous. Can I ask you something? Of course. How long did it take you to learn piano? The woman smiled. The question reminded her of herself many years earlier. A long time. The student looked disappointed. Seeing this, she quickly added, but every little step matters. The student listened carefully. You don't become good all at once. She pointed toward the keyboard. It happens one day at a time. The student nodded thoughtfully. Before leaving, the student asked another question. Do you still practice? The woman laughed. Absolutely. The answer seemed to surprise the student. Even now. Especially now. The student smiled and walked away. The conversation stayed with her. Without realizing it, she had started sharing the lessons she once received from her own teachers. Months passed. The invitations continued arriving. Small community gatherings, charity events, local celebrations. Nothing huge. Nothing overwhelming. Just opportunities to share music. This time, she didn't automatically decline. She accepted a few. Each performance taught her something new. The audience wasn't expecting perfection. They simply enjoyed hearing someone play with genuine feeling. The pressure she once feared began disappearing. Music became enjoyable again. One evening after a small charity event, an audience member approached her. The person smiled warmly. I attended the fundraiser a few months ago. The woman recognized the face immediately. You did. The person nodded. I was there the night you played that simple tune. The woman laughed. People still remember that? The answer came instantly. Of course they do. The person smiled. You reminded people of something important. The woman looked curious. What was that? The person thought for a moment. That it's never too late. Those words stayed with her. It's never too late. Perhaps that was the real reason the story had connected with so many people. It wasn't only about music. It was about rediscovering something meaningful. Everyone understood that feeling. Everyone had something they once loved. A dream. A hobby. Passion. A goal. Sometimes those things get buried beneath responsibilities. Sometimes they disappear from daily life. But that doesn't always mean they are gone forever. Months eventually turned into nearly a year. One afternoon, the same community organization that hosted the original fundraiser contacted her again. This time, the invitation was different. Very different. The organizer sounded excited. We're planning another annual event. The woman smiled. That's wonderful. The organizer paused dramatically. We'd like you to be our featured pianist. For a second, she thought she had heard incorrectly. The featured pianist? Yes. She laughed in disbelief. The organizer continued. You were the most talked about part of last year's event. The woman shook her head even though nobody could see her. That's hard to believe. It's true. After ending the call, she sat quietly for several minutes. featured pianist. The words felt unreal. Not because she dreamed of recognition, because a year earlier she had almost refused to play at all. One simple decision had changed everything. Eventually, the evening of the new fundraiser arrived. The same hall stood waiting, the same stage, the same piano, yet everything felt different. Last year she had entered quietly through the doors. Unknown, unnoticed, uncertain. This year volunteers greeted her warmly. Guests recognized her. People smiled as she walked through the hall. She felt grateful, but she also felt calm. The pressure was gone. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to share music. That was enough. Before the event began, she spent a few moments alone near the piano. The sight brought back memories of that unexpected evening. She remembered standing nearby, wondering whether she should accept the organizer's request. She remembered the nervousness, the uncertainty, the hesitation. Looking back now, she felt thankful she had said yes. Not because it led to more performances, because it helped her reconnect with a part of herself she thought she had lost. Guests gradually filled the hall. The seats filled faster than expected. Excitement spread throughout the room. Many people had heard stories about the previous year's unforgettable performance. Some had attended. Others had only heard about it from friends. Soon the event began. After the opening remarks, the organizer stepped onto the stage. The audience quieted. The organizer smiled. Last year, an unexpected moment became the highlight of our evening. Several guests nodded knowingly. The organizer continued. Tonight, we're honored to welcome back the pianist who created that moment. Applause immediately filled the hall. The woman walked toward the piano. The applause continued. She felt emotional but remained composed. When she reached the bench, she paused briefly. Then she sat down. The room became silent. Unlike last year, people were paying attention from the very beginning. They weren't waiting to discover whether she could play. They already knew. But this time, the woman wasn't focused on the audience. She wasn't focused on expectations. She wasn't focused on proving anything. She was focused on the music. Her hands settled gently on the keys. A small smile appeared. Then she began to play. The melody filled the hall. Warm, honest, comforting, beautiful in its simplicity. As the music flowed through the room, she realized something. Success wasn't the applause. Success wasn't recognition. Success wasn't becoming the featured performer. Success was finding her way back to something she loved. The audience listened quietly. Some smiled. Others closed their eyes. A few appeared emotional. The music connected people once again, just as it had 1 year earlier. When the final note eventually faded, the room erupted into applause. The woman stood and acknowledged the audience. But this time, she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The greatest surprise wasn't that she had shocked everyone in the room. The greatest surprise was what the experience had awakened inside her. A forgotten passion, a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that parts of ourselves can remain hidden for years and still return when we least expect it. And as the applause echoed through the hall, she knew one thing for certain. She would never walk away from music again. Because sometimes a simple tune can change much more than an evening. Sometimes it can change a life.